Chapter 7, Sex Education. It is perhaps unsurprising that I never received any form of sex education or information about my own sexual development from my grandparents, because, although I did not realize it at the time, they were of a different, older generation who found it deeply embarrassing to talk about sex in any shape or form. In our house, if anything remotely sexual ever came on the television, there would be a muttered word or two such as, "We don't want this nonsense, do we?" And channels would be switched as fast as my granddad could find the remote control. That meant that I was fast approaching my teenage years with little more than playground gossip to prepare me for the emotional and physical changes that were beginning to affect my body. I had, of course, picked up a pretty good idea of the general mechanics of reproduction from friends and the occasional television glimpse when parents were out of the room, but it was certainly never explained in any authoritative way. What I did get from my grandparents was a subtle, though continual, pressure to avoid any possibility of teenage pregnancy. Hardly surprising, when you consider what had happened to their own 15-year-old daughter not so many years before. Nothing was ever said directly, but the thought was always there. I must be careful not to have a child as my mother had done. The message was drummed in by implications with small comments, such as, "You know you have to get your education, Miranda," or "You've got to go to university to do well. You want to live your life to the full, perhaps. Go traveling before you settle down. The idea that I must do well at school and get qualified with a good education was a constant theme. I suppose my earliest grasp of the fact that there were distinct differences between the sexual equipment of boys and girls came in my first days at school. You want to live your life to the full, perhaps. Go traveling before you settle down. The idea that I must do well at school and get qualified with a good education was a constant theme. I suppose my earliest grasp of the fact that there were distinct differences between the sexual equipment of boys and girls came in my first days at school. I remember at the age of 6 or 7 playing childish games of doctors and nurses with friends in the more secluded areas of the playground. All variations of some kind on the age-old children's curiosity of "show me yours and I'll show you mine." It was all very innocent and all a far cry from the sort of grown-up doctors and nurses games I play with my clients these days. Ironically, given the fact that I now spend much of my time with people stripping their clothes off in front of me, as a child I was always the one who hung back and never volunteered for the "I'll show you mine" part of the equation. I was far too shy and retiring to have even considered pulling my pants down. I was far more the type who would stand quietly at the back and observe. When I was about 8 years old, there was one girl who had older brothers and sisters and who was, for a while, thought to be the fount of all knowledge about sex. Her brothers had clearly gone out of their way to share all of the intricate details of human sexual reproduction. You have to have 2 boys and 1 girl, and they put the girl on their shoulders and shake her around a lot and this green stuff comes out and you have a baby, she explained one day to a group of us, all eager to learn of the hidden delights of romantic love. Even at that age, I knew that this explanation differed somewhat from the accepted wisdom of our playground. But, looking around at the other girls, I could see that several of them were worrying that her version might just be the correct one. It was at the sort of childish age where you see people kissing on television and immediately start to cringe. You are curious, but it all seems a bit revolting to contemplate. I think I knew enough to find the whole idea of the vigorous shoulder shaking rather amusing, but none of what I knew had ever been verified by a teacher or any other adult. I did talk about what the girl had said with my friend Jennifer, and she agreed with me that it was complete nonsense. She told me that she talked about sex often with her parents and was surprised that I had never asked my mummy about it. "You should ask her where babies come from," she said. The thought of doing that was so alien to me that I never even contemplated following her advice. It was not until several years later, long after I had lost my virginity, that I ever had such a conversation with my grandmother. Purely being mischievous and already knowing the answer, I posed the classic question, "Mom, where do babies come from?" "Well, it's the husband planting a seed, and then it grows," was the hesitant reply. "Like in a cabbage patch," I ventured, trying desperately not to laugh. No, really like that. "I'm sure they will tell you all about it at school soon." I was fast approaching my teens, knowing most of the mechanics of sex, but nothing of the emotional turmoil it might bring. With our lack of communication about the subject, my grandmother had never even mentioned the concept of periods to me, although I knew that I would one day start them because there were already girls in my class at middle school who were having them. Then my best friend Jennifer came on with her periods before me, and in probably more detail than I might have wanted, insisted on telling me all about it. My own period started when I was 12, in the holidays between leaving middle school and starting at high school. I remember I was wearing blue fishnet tights under a denim skirt and had been shopping with my grandmother. When I got home, I discovered I was bleeding, but of course I had no pad or tampons to use. I talked to my grandmother, who had nothing for me either. "Isn't that odd?" she said. "I was thinking today when we were out that I should have bought something for you because you would be due around this sort of age, but I didn't actually get anything at all." That was not actually much help to me at the time, but my ever-resourceful grandmother made up a kind of pad out of cotton wool and gauze and then bought me proper pads after that. And so I celebrated my 13th birthday knowing little more than I had picked up in playground gossip. I was vaguely interested in boys, and I think I must, by then, have discovered masturbation. It was a secret pleasure to be enjoyed under the bedclothes at night, and increasingly often in the morning, before dragging myself out of bed to face another day at school. My day-to-day life, however, was still largely devoted to the twin pursuits of coping with becoming a teenager and with sport at school. And fortunately for my moral welfare, the same could never have been said about my best friend Jennifer. Although still a virgin, Jennifer was crazy about sex and boys, any boy, of any shape or size or age. Now, don't get me wrong. I was curious about boys, but just not on the same industrial scale as Jennifer. I used to spend a lot of my time at her home because both her parents worked, and we would often have the run of the house before they got back in the evening. She could always get into her parents' bedroom, and I was soon introduced to her father's collection of soft porn, girly magazines. More intrusively still, Jennifer would delight in peeking through her mother's wardrobe and showing me her kinky underwear. We would sometimes dress up in them and show off in front of the bedroom mirror. They were all rather innocent and Summers-type outfits rather than seriously kinky fetish wear, but it seemed terribly naughty at the time. It was certainly hard to imagine my much older mother buying anything remotely like that. It was sometimes hard to get Jennifer to think or talk about anything else other than boys, and so there was certain inevitability about what was to happen next. My friend's voracious appetite for meeting men, and my naive willingness to follow, led us both into danger one day. We regularly played a game after school in which we would head for the local shops and straightaway hitch up our school uniform skirts shorter and shorter. The game was to see how many car drivers would beep their horns, and how many men might try to chat us up on the way. I loved the attention, and was every bit as keen as Jennifer, but we were both about to learn a valuable lesson, that you can take such teasing too far. On one sunny afternoon, we were walking to the local shops as usual and happily collecting our requisite quota of beeps from the passing cars. Suddenly, one vehicle pulled into the side of the road right in front of us. A young Asian guy got out and stood smiling in front of us. I could see a couple of older men in the back of the car, smiling and friendly. This young Asian lad came out with a line which, even then to our 13-year-old ears, sounded as corny as hell. "My dog's just had some really cute puppies," he said. "Do you want to come and have a look at them?" "No thanks," I said. "Thanks, but no thanks." "Oh, come on. We only live up the road. Where are you two from? Come on and have a look. You'll love them." The more both of us said we weren't interested, the more persistent he became. He was chatting, but I ended up just repeating, "No, no, I'm not interested." While Jennifer finally said, "No, I'm not going to see them. I've got puppies at home," and took a step back. "Come on, Jennifer," I said, "let's go." With no warning, he suddenly grabbed me around the middle and tried to drag me to the car. I was too shocked to scream, but I was wriggling and fighting like mad. He might have succeeded in forcing me in through the open door, but then Jennifer grabbed me and started pulling me away. He got hold of Jennifer too, but by then had hold of the fence, and nothing was going to make me let go. Even at that age, I was strong and weary from all the sports I played at school, and I was hanging on for dear life. We were both screaming, "Get off! Get off us!" and the guys still sitting in the car were shouting, "Come on! Come on! Get her in quick!" It was total chaos and getting noisier by the second, but, amazingly, no other cars or pedestrians stopped to come to our aid. In the end, our attacker realized that his friends were not going to help, and, without them, he wasn't going to win. He swore wildly at me, released his grip, and jumped into the car as it sped off. It had been the closest of calls. We were both shaking with the shock, but thankfully, we were both unharmed. We had not walked far from our school gates, and there was a payphone right there, so we decided to call the police. We had the car registration number and knew exactly what the guys had looked like, especially the younger one who had been the most dangerous. It was the one and only time that I have had to dial 999, and it was a complete waste of time. Nobody answered the emergency call. Hardly able to believe it, I dialed the operator and blurted out that I needed to speak to the police. There was a short pause, and then the operator was apologizing profusely. "I'm sorry, caller. I just cannot get a reply from the police service." In the confusion that followed, the operator offered to take down our details. "I'll get someone to contact you as soon as I can." The last thing that Jennifer and I wanted, however, was to have the police turning up on our doorsteps. My parents would never have let us out again. I instantly hung up the phone and we hurried back home. To this day, I regret that my emergency call was not answered. That young guy had been determined to get us into that car. His older friends had been anxious to get their hands on us, and I just hope that nothing ever happened to other women because they were not caught that day. The attempted abduction should have been salutary lesson to Jennifer and me, but at the age of 13, we all believe we are untouchable and immortal, and at 13, I was only really interested in the opposite sex in a ought to get a boyfriend sort of way, but my friend's obsession with sex and my childish willingness to go along with her were soon to cost us both our virginity. Chapter 8: Losing My Virginity. On one of the many afternoons when she spurned getting the bus in order to walk home from school, Jennifer had met a man more than twice her age, whom she felt was a promising candidate to take her unwanted virginity. She told me all about him the following morning at school. "Oh, Miranda, he's great. He's called Ron, he's 26, and he wants to see me again, and he's got a friend, and he really wants to meet you too." The age of Jennifer's latest conquest might perhaps have set alarm bells ringing in my mind, but I was well used to her chatting up every man, in fact any man with whom she came into contact. It was after all the whole purpose of our regular strolls through West London with our school skirts hitched high on our thighs. "Oh, come on, Miranda, it'll be fun. He's good looking and his friend really wants to see you, and you have to come with me." Despite some initial reservations, I agreed, as I always did, to go along with Jennifer's plan. We set off after classes to meet her new man and his friend who had clearly been earmarked for me. Although Jennifer was the one who always did all of the talking, we both knew that I was the one to whom most of the men were attracted. It was therefore nothing out of the ordinary for Jennifer's guy, Ron, to start chatting me up as soon as we met. It did not upset Jennifer at all. She was equally happy getting to know his friend, and I was pleasantly surprised by Ron's good looks. It was a rainy afternoon when we all met outside Ron's parents' house, a mile or two from my school. It seemed only natural to accept the boys, invitation to come into the garage to get out of the rain. What was perhaps not quite so natural was that 2 mattresses had been laid out on the garage floor with a few blankets to transform them into usable, if temporary, beds. There was, as you will already have guessed, a certain inevitability about what was to happen over the next half hour. Ron was kissing me and his friend was kissing Jennifer, and things just rolled along a little bit too quickly for me to think. I lay down on the bed with Ron and didn't really resist when he started stroking my body. Boys had touched me before, but not quite in the urgent and intimate way he was touching me now. I can't pretend that I was enthralled by what was happening, but I went along with it willingly enough. It all just sort of happened, really. Looking back on the events of that afternoon, it is obvious that those 2 26-year-olds had planned all along to seduce us with the minimum of fuss and effort. Being half their age, both virgins and still at school, we must have been the easiest of targets. The only thing that might have given me pause for thought was if they had not used protection. The story of my own birth mother's pregnancy from her first sexual encounter was always in my mind, but Ron and his friend had each come prepared with condoms, and that was never an issue. The precise details of this distinctly unromantic tryst are now a little hazy. The lights were on in the garage, but Jennifer and I were both lying under blankets. I was still wearing most of my school uniform and worried that it was getting damp and creased. I certainly remember being self-conscious about my body as Ron fumbled his way inside my clothes while continuing to smother me with kisses. I don't think he even undressed me completely, just unbuttoning my white school blouse, lifting my skirt up, and pulling off my pants. There was the briefest of pauses in his attentions as he slipped a condom on under the blanket, and I was aware that Jennifer was lying a few feet away. Her guy was by now on top of her, and she was making all of the correct hua. I'm really enjoying this sort of noises. A few moments later, I was conscious of a tight, painful sensation as Ron entered me and started rocking backwards and forwards. I think I made a few noises as well, although the truth is that I was thinking, oh God, this isn't really very nice at all. It's bloody uncomfortable. If this is what it is all about, I am not interested anymore. In common, I believe, with many women's own experiences, the most charitable thing I can say about my first fuck was that it didn't last very long. Ron seemed to come very quickly. I received a few slightly more perfunctory kisses as Ron rolled off of me and lay for a moment under the blanket. The others had clearly finished as well, and I could hear Jennifer giggling and muttering with her man. It didn't seem at all unnatural when one of the guys suddenly suggested, let's swap. Clearly having planned the move all along, the 2 men quickly changed beds and partners, and I found myself now kissing the friend who had always been intended for me from the start. He was a nice enough looking guy as well, and accepting him was presumably part of the deal. I did not raise any objection the second time around, even though the sex was now a distinctly painful activity which I just hoped would be over as rapidly as it had been with Ron. One quick condom application later, a few more uncomfortable thrusts, and my daily double of losing my virginity to 2 men in the same afternoon was complete. The same cannot be said of my poor friend Jennifer. I knew that she really liked Ron, but he was clearly having problems. Jennifer was disappointed that Ron could not get erect enough to have sex with her as well. She's killed my dick. She's killed my dick, he kept saying, presumably needing to use my virginal tightness as an excuse for his own erectile problems with Jennifer. Despite her disappointment in not arousing Ron enough to perform his manly duties, Jennifer was delighted to have lost her virginity. The footballer's glitch over the moon best describes her mood as we continued our interrupted walk home. We're women now, she said several times. Jennifer asked me how I was feeling. Sore, I replied, and worried we're not going to get home in time for our 7:30 p.m. curfew. And then I'm in trouble with my mum. After what had happened that afternoon, my need to get home at the time my grandparents had demanded perhaps illustrates the pointlessness of such parental restrictions. The truth is, however, that I was undoubtedly a little shell-shocked by what had happened. I hadn't had the slightest inkling when I agreed to meet the guys that such a thing was going to happen that day. Now that it had happened, I think I was emotionally a little numb. I certainly was not physically numb because I remember sitting at school the next day and being worried that I was still so very uncomfortable between my legs. It had not been a nice experience, nothing like as pleasurable as I had imagined, and I wasn't overly anxious to try it again. Even so, and to my shame, it wasn't long before my still tender vagina was called into action again. Just 3 days later, on a Saturday, Jennifer was chasing a boy far nearer to our own age, and I was drafted in as usual to make up a double date with his friend. Once again, however, the plan went slightly awry because I ended up with Trevor, Jennifer's original target, and she started dating his friend Mark. With the cast list sorted to my satisfaction, we spent the afternoon wandering around the shops and a local park with the boys on the lookout for somewhere to take us a little more intimate than the town center. Eventually, the guys resorted to drastic measures. They broke into a disused water tower and led us upstairs to a room that, although mostly bare concrete and industrial pipes, was at least warm and dry. Judging by the debris scattered around, others must have been dossing there in the recent past and probably using drugs. Unlike the first occasion with Ron, I now knew what was likely to happen, and the naughtiness of these new, different surroundings made me excited in a way I certainly had not been before. Trevor and I ended up having sex while Jennifer had her evil way with Mark on the other side of the room. The game was nothing like as painful as it had been a few days earlier. I think my body had sort of recovered from that agony, but again, to me, it wasn't really an enjoyable experience. Not as traumatic as the first time, but I kind of felt that it was one of those things that guys want to do, and that therefore I needed to get it out of the way as soon as possible and get on with other things. I do remember being in the missionary position on the rather hard floor and being grateful that it was once again certainly not a marathon session of sex, even though the earth had hardly moved for either of us. Trevor was keen enough to ask me out for another date, and we were boyfriend and girlfriend for a while. He lived just a short bus ride away from my grandparents' home, and sex was regularly on the menu when I could slip away from the house and hop on the bus to his home. By then, the sex had got better. As I was still barely 13 years old, my grandparents were constantly questioning where I was going, and I constructed what I thought was a foolproof and elaborate web of lies to conceal my new and growing enthusiasm for outings after school. The best and most obvious excuse was that I was simply seeing Jennifer, but she was now regularly shagging Mark, and the times of our date sometimes failed to coincide. My strict 7.3 curfew was broken more and more often as I found it harder to tear myself away from the fun of my boyfriend's bed, and my grandparents started digging a little deeper into my life. Once they realized that my Jennifer excuse was holed below the waterline, my next line of defense was to invent fictitious evenings with another friend from school. The Asian girl I claimed to be visiting did exist, but we certainly were never friends. I had grasped at her name as a drowning man grasps at a straw, but I am sure that her parents would have been baffled to learn that I was allegedly a frequent visitor to their house, a home that in reality I had never even seen. Amazingly, my grandmother trustingly accepted my tale. For a while, my downfall came because I had never counted on my grandmother sharing quite as much of my life as she did do with her daughter, my missing biological mother, who then lived more than 30 miles away with her husband and growing young family. My birth mother had always stayed as part of my life, visiting me at my grandparents' home or having me visit her when I stayed with my aunt nearby. There had been lots of toys and presents and clothes from her through the years, but the relationship had been far more strained ever since I had discovered the truth about my birth. Now, unbeknown to me, the mum who I lived with was sharing her worries about my late nights and suspect behavior with my birth mum, a younger woman who represented a much more daunting prospect when it came to lying through my teeth. The first I knew of her growing involvement was a visit in which she suggested we go for a walk together to the local shops. En route, I found myself being cross-questioned at length by a woman who was far harder to fool than my adoptive parents. "So, what's this girl's name?" she asked chattily. "Oh, and where does she live? Which road is that? What is her address? What's her mum like? Does she have many brothers and sister for you to play with?" The questions poured out in a torrent that I was ill-equipped to dam or divert. For a while I struggled to maintain the pretense of my Asian friend, but I knew too few real facts to fool anyone. "I think it's a good idea if I meet this girl's mum, don't you?" my birth mother said. "Shall I give her a call?" Single quotes. It was a killer blow, and red-faced and stammering I blurted out that I had told a little fib to my grandmother. That little fib was soon exposed as a series of whopping great lies as I finally admitted that I was seeing a boy, and that my clandestine visits to his home each evening were the reason for breaking my curfew. I had been well and truly caught out, but I knew that, however tough the questioning, one fact must remain a tight-lipped secret. "I'm worried. Are you having sex with this boy?" my birth mother demanded. A question that would never have passed my grandmother's lips. "No, of course, I'm not. He's not like that." "Well, you know it's against the law, don't you? You can get done for that, at your age, and so can the boy. If the police catch you, you'll be in trouble." The prospect of PC Plod peeking through the curtains to spy on me every time I dropped my knickers was worrying, but seemed to be a little unlikely. More worrying was my family's joint insistence that in future, they would need to safeguard my welfare more closely. "We need to keep tabs on you a little more," Earth Mother insisted. "You should hold on to your virginity until you meet someone special, the man you'll marry." I was the only one among those in the room who knew that her concern was a little late in arriving, quite a while too late. The end result of the fibs debacle was that I was grounded for weeks by the combined forces of my grandmother and my birth mother working in harmony to ensure my moral welfare. I was not allowed to go out anywhere other than to school and back, and my relationship with Trevor was stopped in its tracks. Demonstrating the true spirit of schoolgirl friendship, Jennifer took the opportunity to start going out with him herself. As soon as she mentioned that she had seen Trevor the evening before, I knew beyond a shadow of doubt that they must have had sex. I didn't really mind because I was imprisoned in my nan's house anyway. It did feel a little unfair when she revealed that my former boyfriend had been grading my performance. "He says you've got a 10 out of 10 body, but a 6 out of 10 face," she announced with some glee. So, after the briefest of outings, my burgeoning sexual history had pretty much ground to a halt. A one-afternoon stand with two older men who took my virginity had been followed by a few inexpert couplings with a lad more my own age. None of the above had been much to write home about, and none of it had been enjoyable enough to encourage me to seek sex elsewhere. I suppose that my reluctance to repeat the experience was some sign of how well my grandparents had succeeded in instilling at least some sense of morality throughout my childhood. I could not have articulated it at the time, but I knew that something was not quite right about mere random sexual encounters. I did feel that I wanted a boyfriend, but knew in my heart that I should be having sex with the proper partner, rather than with strangers to whom I had barely even spoken. No such standards had ever been spelled out directly at home, but the message had been repeatedly conveyed by implication. It was a drip-drip, almost subliminal feed of my grandparents' morality. "You do not have sex until you are married. Look what happened to your mother at such a young age. Be careful, be a good girl, behave." My grandparents had never had that sex education talk with me, but clearly something of their message had stuck in my mind. Perhaps more importantly, I was also spending a lot less time at that stage with my sex-mad friend Jennifer. Without her around to chat up a seemingly endless string of would-be partners, I was happy to concentrate on my schoolwork and to try and solve my perennial problem of never having any money. The age limit for working in a Saturday job was supposed to be 15, but for a long time I had looked older than my age. It was easy enough to get a job as a waitress in a local cafe, the first of a string of dull jobs which served one purpose for me better than any other. They made me determined to get a good education, good qualifications in order that I would never again get stuck in that type of boring, dead-end job. I was around 13 years old when I started my first waitressing job. The wages were about £10 each Saturday, but that could rise by another pound or two if the customers contributed to my tips jar. The money felt like a fortune to somebody who had never been given more than £1 a week pocket money throughout their childhood. I can remember with crystal clarity how I spent my first week's wages. I bought a denim dress from a clothes shop just around the corner from the cafe. It was a fantastic sensation. Wow, I thought, I can actually buy my own clothes. How cool is that? Although I didn't know it at the time, the stretchy, tight denim dress would prove to be an excellent investment. The following Saturday I wore it to work in the cafe. There was one customer who was like, "Wow, you look amazing." He was seriously chatting me up and making a continuous string of lurid comments suggesting that if I bent over just a little bit further in my short dress, then I might show off my knickers. He was much older than me, a dirty, horrid old man, but he kept on giving my tips for my jar. Consequently, just smiled it off every time he called me over. "Oh, just bend over here would you, and do this. Pick this up for me." I found him obnoxious, but he kept making a point of showing me that he was dropping a pound here or there in my jar, which I instantly grabbed back and slipped into my pocket. I also made a point of never quite bending low enough to give him the reward he was seeking. It was an early lesson in handling men. Always leave the customer wanting more. Not all of the customers were as horrible as that guy, but I did learn that there are some rude people, really incredibly rude people in this world. Waitressing was hard, but I had plans for my wages. There had been a disaster at home, and I knew exactly how that money was going to be put to good use. My nan had broken her Hoover. Unable to afford another, she had been struggling for months to keep the house clean with the tiny, manual carpet sweeper. That was the reason I saved up my earnings for the next 2 months. I know it may not now seem like a brilliant present, but I was finally able to take my £80 and buy a vacuum cleaner in Argos. I carted it all the way back home on the bus and gave it to my nan for her birthday. It's one of my happiest teenage memories. She's brought me a Hoover. "I've got a Hoover again," she called out to my granddad. There actually were tears in her eyes, and I knew she could not have been happier if I had purchased a Cartier diamond necklace. I thought, oh bless, as she insisted on plugging it in that moment in order to vacuum every carpet in the house from top to bottom. The downside was that my granddad and I had to endure hours of multiple cleaning with her popping in and out of each room, luring to herself over the sound of the vacuum cleaner. "This is so wonderful, wonderful. She's bought me a Hoover." My work in the cafe had served me, and the preternatural cleanliness of my grandmother's home well. It did feel, however, that it was time to move on to a Saturday job that might be a fraction more interesting. I found another opportunity locally that offered slightly better wages and the chance to stay serving behind a counter rather than mixing in with the frequently obnoxious and ungrateful customers. The only trouble was that accepting this particular summer job meant facing up to my only serious fear in life. I have a confession to make. My name is Miranda. I am a secret spexophobic. It did feel, however, that it was time to move on to a Saturday job that might be a fraction more interesting. I found another opportunity locally that offered slightly better wages and the chance to stay serving behind a counter rather than mixing in with the frequently obnoxious and ungrateful customers. The only trouble was that accepting this particular summer job meant facing up to my only serious fear in life. I have a confession to make. My name is Miranda. I am a secret spexophobic. I have a morbid fear of wasps. Now, every good dominatrix loves uncovering a client's secret phobias. They're deep-seated fears that one can exploit to weaken their will, bend them to their knees, and generally scare them half to death. Facing one's fears is a major part of why my clients come to visit me in the first place. They may outwardly be asking for a spanking, caning, public humiliation, and degradation, or to be wrapped up in multiple layers of latex. Inwardly they are unknowingly facing their innermost and most secret fears. I always think that when a man or a woman confesses they are claustrophobic, for example, that a spell in my dungeon coffin box will suit them just fine. It is a person-sized box in which I may bind you immovably with multiple leather straps securing your wrists, forearms, ankles, calves, thighs, tummy, chest, and forehead tight to the wall. When the coffin lid closes shut, just inches from your face, you are unable to move a muscle, unable to see through the inky blackness, and even the sound of the outside world will be muffled. How long I leave you in that state depends on me. The skill, of course, which I have honed to a fine art over the years, is to know precisely when your rising terror is almost, but not quite, at the point of true panic. The whimpers you make, the sound of your breathing speeding up, the note of desperation in your voice, all tell me precisely when you have suffered enough to have pumped up adrenaline levels and your sexual desires to the max, whilst leaving you just on the right side of sanity. Having praised the therapeutic benefits of facing one's fear, it will surprise you not one jot to know that I would not possibly follow my own advice and face up to my own phobia, sphexophobia, the fear of wasps. Given my total terror of having wasps anywhere near me, it was perhaps not the wisest move to accept my new job in a baker's shop. Attracted by the ever-present scent of jam donuts and cream cakes, the shop was Wasp Central Station throughout the summer months. I was paranoid about being stung and once fled from the shop, abandoning an open till full of money rather than face up to a massive wasp that had chased me round the room. We are talking about a big wasp here, so large it could hardly fly. A doodlebug of an insect, probably a hornet, and maybe worse. It is never easy to understand where such irrational fears come from, but I do remember one childhood incident which may have been to blame for turning me into a manic wasp of phobe. I was perhaps 5 years old when I saw a young girl in the playground who had 2 wasps caught up in her long blonde hair. She was screaming and slapping her hair trying to stop them buzzing round her ears, and everyone, especially me, was too scared to help her. I can remember thinking, oh God, thank God that isn't me. Single quotes. No way on earth could I have helped her. The connection is that my reaction now to wasps follows a similar pattern. I throw up my hands to cover my ears and look around for something with which to cut off my hair if it flies in my direction. Better to have a rough and ready urchin haircut than a wasp in my ear. Chapter 9. A Good Education. From an early age, my loving grandfather drummed into me the importance of a good education. A highly intelligent man, Granddad was of a generation for whom a university education was outside of their wildest dreams. Instead, he had left school early, joined the Navy, and had later worked in a frustratingly modest job at a West London factory. Finally, ill health forced him into premature retirement and led to a life in which we all existed on state benefits and the tiny sum my grandmother earned as a school dinner lady. Perhaps spurred on by the way that good schooling had been denied to him, he was determined that I should not suffer the same fate. A good education. Miranda, he would tell me, you must get a good education. That's what will get you a good job, good money, and a good life. Get a good education. With his words ringing in my ears, it was I who selected an all-girls school for my secondary education. It may appear to be a decision more mature than my years might allow, but I was already aware that schools differed in their respective performances, and also that girls almost always do better when the distraction of boys is removed from the educational equation. My home was just a few hundred yards from a mixed high school to which all of my friends were going. You could literally look out of our front door and see the school gates. I knew, however, that it was not a particularly high-achieving school. That knowledge came not from some in-depth study of educational league tables, but from far more down-to-earth data. My grandmother worked there, and she didn't rate it at all. My chosen alternative was much further away in Acton, the more highly regarded Ellen Wilkinson School for Girls. Getting there involved a lengthy bus ride and then a walk of more than a mile, but I knew it was the only way of keeping the faith with my granddad's dream. I never quite gathered who Ellen Wilkinson was, but I did know her school was my best shot at that all important good education. I always did well at school and working at weekends and in school. Holidays didn't stop my progress in the classroom. I could perhaps have done better, but life was always so busy with work and sport that I found I could leave exam preparation to the last moment and still pass with flying colors. Even for subjects such as English literature, I would often get by without ever reading the books we were supposed to be studying. I would pick up instant study guides and flip through the summaries they provided, gleaning enough information to fake my way through the required essays and discussions. The one area that I could never fake, then or now, was my inability to spell. Often, the simplest words can leave me stumped. The problem was that my teachers put all of the emphasis on skills such as being able to structure an essay and took no account of spelling. I would get top marks for an essay and receive the comment, "Obviously the spelling needs more work," but I was never marked down for that weakness. On top of that, I was always bursting with ideas that I wanted to get down on paper, and I would write 20 pages when other kids were writing 2. That sort of urgency leaves no time for proofreading or worrying if one's handwriting can even be deciphered. My other problem in gaining the education that I hoped would lead to a sparkling and fascinating career was the lack of parental support. My grandparents' tiny home, where I wrote on the kitchen table, was hardly made for undisturbed homework, and my grandparents, deeply caring though they were, had no idea of how they might provide an environment conducive to study. Their lack of supportive skills was even more noticeable when it came to careers advice. I can remember saying to my grandmother, "How do I know what job I should do and what courses there are? I don't know what to do." She had no idea of how to help. She was a good dressmaker and had done menial cleaning work, so had not the faintest idea how to look for a job in an office. My grandparents' knowledge of the careers market came from jobs such as working in a shop or on the factory floor. They could never have guided me towards being a doctor or a lawyer or any profession like that. Yet when I look back, I bear no resentment. Their lack of knowledge was their limitation, not a lack of willingness to help. I could get slightly more guidance on the occasions when my birth mother came to visit us, knowing that other parents at the school often set their own children private homework. She would give me writing tasks to complete, and sometimes we would talk about what career I might follow, but such advice was thinly spread and infrequently offered. In retrospect, I can see that my life might have taken a very different direction if I had been raised by my younger birth mother rather than by elderly grandparents. She could never have loved me more than they undoubtedly did, but perhaps my ambitions might have been channeled in other directions. And maybe the good things my grandparents gave me, a strong work ethic, a drive to succeed, a desire to make my own way in the world, would have been lost. There is, however, one part of my teenage life that could have been very different if I had been raised by my mother rather than my grandmother. The larger than natural generation gap between me and my parents was having an effect. My unstoppable desire for increasing independence throughout my early teens was coming up against the immovable object of my elderly grandparents' rules of behavior. It was a clash beyond the normal generations. It could only lead to trouble.